Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Horizon webinar on avoiding risk through governance. We're going to be talking about the steps that you normally take to set up Archibus's compliance application to avoid risk and control costs. I'm going to give everyone just another minute to log in because we do have everyone typically logging in this minute. So I'm going to just mute myself for a few more seconds and then we'll kind of officially begin. While we're doing that, I've asked a question in the chat to see if anyone on the call has already thought about implementing compliance. And if you have done that, go ahead and answer the chat if you'd like. Or if you have any questions in general, that would be great to add those now or during the presentation, so that at the end we do have 10 to 15 minutes typically that are designed to answer those questions. So feel free to use that chat. Okay, that wasn't quite a minute, but I'm going to go ahead and get started so we can cover a lot of ground today. Governance and risk and avoidance of risk in general is a big topic. There's a lot of different areas of concern related to government. So I'm going to try to keep this fairly short today and focus on the steps to Archibus. But generally speaking, not as many customers of Archibus will buy the compliance application. So before I begin talking about the steps to use it, I want to talk a little bit about governance itself. I do have to do a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. First of all, I think a lot of this is the 7th session now. I'm going to skip introductions. This is the 7th session now in the Horizon Knowledge Series. And we were talking about compliance today, and this is kind of on purpose that we've done this later on in the series, and that is because we've kind of covered a lot of operational topics early on. We talked about services and organizing services around equipment and assets. Then we talked about asset management in Archibus. We talked about building information modeling assets and how to keep those assets in sync. And then we talked about managing assets by automating workflows, creating SLAs, generating preventive maintenance procedures. And in the last session, we talked more about large-scale projects and capital planning and budgeting and the applications capabilities in those areas. Compliance is more of an umbrella application. It kind of takes a big picture view of what's going on with operations, and the goal of it is to collect all of the different requirements that an organization have and give them a tool to manage those requirements in one place, but also to link those requirements to the actual day-to-day operations that you're tracking in your business with the other Archibus applications. So that's kind of what we're going to be trying to cover today in this session. Ultimately, of course, you're trying to work on and reduce your costs to the organization. And some of those costs are not necessarily real costs. Some of them are opportunity costs associated with not doing something that you should be doing. So we're going to talk a little bit about opportunity first. I'm going to talk about the steps that it takes to set up Archibus's compliance and risk management application. And then, of course, some of the steps for setup. And I've done this in an opposite order that I would normally do this for this type of session, and that is because the setup steps really are not too important in compliance with the application. You can jump right in and start using the main portion of the application without doing a lot of setup. So I'm going to cover that after we talk about the main steps to use compliance. So let's talk a little bit about the opportunity here. I mean, in most organizations, you as facility managers and real estate folks are responsible for a great many things, and some of those things are human safety, human happiness in the workplace in some cases, environmental sustainability. You are the stewards of the built environment, and as such, you play this really important role in a lot of different areas. And of course, some of those areas, number one, are in risk reduction. So risk reduction in terms of facilities, in terms of what we're talking about today, really means managing or reducing the number of fines and penalties that you have to face as an organization because of the business practices that you follow. Some of it is about making sure that you reduce the amount of money you're spending on your contracts. You don't want to be overpaying on contracts for work that's being underdone. In some cases, you have huge construction projects going on, and you have to have a way of managing the costs of those projects, because as we all know, most projects will be overrun in terms of scope or cost or whatever it might be. And ultimately, your job is to find a way to keep those reduced as much as possible. And of course, the primary job is to make sure that our employees, our staff, people coming into the workplace are safe, that they feel good, that they're healthy. And if we can, ultimately, we want to also help the environment and make sure that we're not doing anything to the environment that we shouldn't be. So all of these things count as risk, and many of you are responsible for a lot of these different areas. And of course, as part of that is being able to continue the business, always making sure that your business can continue through and the business can run safely. So that means business continuity is another opportunity that you have as facility managers, because as part of all these operational activities that you do day to day, part of that is preventing risk, preventing the things that could happen, being prepared, protecting the human life that's part of your facilities, mitigating any issues or risk that might come up. And then of course, when something does happen, when you do get a penalty or you do have a contract that's been broken, or God forbid, you have a natural disaster or something, a terrorist strike, whatever it might be, you have an ability to respond quickly and recover quickly because you have plans in place and a framework in place for dealing with these types of things. So without going on too much of a pedestal here and to talk about governments, I just want to cover this kind of concept. For me, this is really important part of the jobs that we all are participating in, and part of that means accountability. You need to, in some way, the organization needs to have some framework in place for accountability, that you need to make sure that all of these things are happening day to day, that you're not relying on one group of people to be responsible for one job and not making sure that there's some form of governance overseeing that. So accountability it means making sure that your PM programs are in place and that they're being executed faithfully. It means making sure that health and safety is being managed and being followed and tracked properly, making sure construction projects are being executed faithfully and accurately and on time and within budget. And it also means, again, that you're not having an environmental impact. And the list will go on. And you see over here on the right-hand side, I have this list. I have an image from Saitama Prefecture, from the prefectural government, where all of the emergency response units are all together in one place performing work together. And I like this picture because it shows the teamwork that's required to make this happen, to make governance take place, and to make sure that accountability is there within an organization. But not only that, and I think what's missing oftentimes is the verifiability of this work that you're doing, making sure that you can verify that contracts are being performed, making sure that you have the data in place to back up what you say you're doing. Not only can you say that you're doing something, not only can you pay the contractors to do the work that they're supposed to do, but you can verify that that work is being done, and you can verify that the money being spent is being well spent. You can also verify the work is completed, and if there's any kind of issues, you can remediate any kind of problems in response. So this is very important. And I think a lot of Archibus clients would like to get to this level, but don't always have the budget or the resources to be able to have this governance in place. What you don't want to be, I think, is in the position of having governance placed on you from outside or external agencies, and not be really able to comply with these types of requirements. And there are loads, as you all know. Just the list of international government frameworks are quite large. I think a lot of companies will use things like ISO 22301, NFPA 1600 is a common international standard for fire safety and emergency planning. BS 25999 is in the Great Britain, HB 292, etc. And this is just the regulatory types of things that most companies will have to be responsible for. In addition to that, just about every business I work with will have hundreds of different types of requirements, regulations, requirements, internal service agreements, contractor service agreements, you name it. These are all things that the organization has to cling to run themselves as required. And there's often not one team responsible responsible. All of these contracts, regulations, they're often mixed out amongst multiple departments, and there's no one place where you're kind of tracking what operationally you are doing to be in compliance with these different regulations. So what Archibus is offering here is a place for you to store this information about, in terms of all of the different requirements that you have, the hundreds of requirements that are there. Tie them back to contracts, tie them to regular preventive maintenance procedures, tie them back to projects, tie them back to vendors who are going to be providing services. Whatever you might have, you can make a tie back to those regulations, and then tie whatever you're doing operationally in terms of preventive maintenance and work orders and projects to the responsible parties, and ultimately assign responsibility and accountability to each of these actions. So that's the goal of the Archibus application called compliance. And the idea here is that you're trying to avoid a lot monetary risk, the risk of human life, of not being healthy, environmental impact, and so on. If you look at Archibus as a platform, compliance sits as an umbrella application above the other applications. So day to day in terms of operations, your teams will be using project management to manage projects, condition assessments to do your regular facility condition assessments, preventive maintenance and reactive maintenance teams. You have teams that are responsible for preparing for emergencies, health and safety teams, and of course hazardous abatement, hazardous materials, waste management, and so on. And a lot of the actions and the asset management type of activity, the actions related to these services, they're all managed in Archibus's on-demand work, service desk application, and workplace application, and so on. So you name it. All of these things we do day to day ultimately are done because of some requirement that we have to comply with. And that requirement should be in the captured in the compliance application and tied back to the work that we're doing. So compliance for me is quite interesting, but it's funny that it's very, very difficult to get all the different groups within an organization kind of on board and communicating with each other to share their information in one place to be tracking it. But Archibus does have this nice kind of set of applications that give you the ability to reduce your risk and comply with or be able to continue your business in the event that something happens, and ultimately reduce the costs of things. So I'm going to just give you a quick glimpse of compliance as an application. It does really two main things for you. One is that it allows you to, again, to keep track of all your requirements in one place, to assign responsibility for each of those requirements, and then to generate a regular set of events for those governance, those people who are responsible for the governance of each of the activities. And what this means is it's not the people responsible for doing preventive maintenance, it's not the people responsible for doing project execution or reacting to work orders or closing out work orders or space planning, whatever the activity might be. This is about assigning responsibility and events for the people who need to oversee that, for the people who are checking out, the inspection teams, for example, the inspectors, the planners, those types of people who need this type of oversight. So this is what these events will allow you to do. And all of these things will tie back into Archibus's work history if you have it. And the events are allowed to, you can set up different types of notifications as part of compliance to make sure that the system is automatically emailing different groups of people depending on what the requirement is. So a big part of compliance is the ability to modify and create your own type of notifications to different parties. So this kind of a compliance event management is one big functionality that's part of the application, besides just being an inventory of all of the things that you're required to do. The second function that I think compliance is good for is the ability to generate surveys and inspections to inspect work that's being done. So there's a questionnaire functionality within Archibus, within the compliance application, that can be set up and can be generated as part of these events, that you can have regular inspections being generated automatically. Or for corrective actions, you can actually generate checklists or inspections for your regular preventive maintenance procedures to make sure that people are following a step-by-step set of instructions, and not just following it, but actually signing off on each step to say, yes, they've done something, or no, they haven't done something, or this particular step passed and this particular step failed. They took this measurement of this refrigeration unit, and so on. So these are the two types of things that compliance will do: track your compliance items, generate events for those people who are responsible for the compliance, and then also generate a series of inspections and surveys for people. Now, what we're going to be talking about today is what does it take, or what are the steps that you take to set this up? And that's where we're going to get into our two-part set of steps here. One is part one is setting up the regulation items themselves, the actual requirements or contractual items, the inspections, any violations that you have to pay, any penalties that you might have for not doing these types of things. So that's the kind of step one. And that involves these 6 steps I have here of managing what Archibus calls the compliance drill down of regulations, programs, and requirements. Then we assign preventive maintenance or questionnaires to each of these items. We can generate the events for the oversight functionality. And then ultimately, you're just quarter to quarter, you're managing the events, you're managing the actual compliance to the regulation. And if there are any kind of issues, fines, permit violations, whatever it might be, you're tracking those as well to keep track of the overall cost of not being in compliance. So I'll talk a little bit about this. Archibus does have this kind of language that it uses that may not be clear to everybody when you look at it, and that's because the way that the system is set up is quite open for interpretation. And so how Archibus has interpreted this level of detail is that ultimately companies have a lot of different requirements, which they're going to call a regulation. And that regulation might be a law and that's been enacted. It might be a building or fire safety code. It might be a corporate obligation. It might be a maintenance contract that you have with a vendor. These are a requirement to do maintenance against your buildings. It could be any kind of general requirement. And that requirement ultimately leads to some sort of planned activity, which Archibus will call a program in this case. And so a planned activity could be, any activity, fire drills, a construction project, an agreement with a vendor to provide different services. And that's all a program is. It's just kind of an overarching way of managing these types of, actionable tasks. And the actionable tasks are what Archibus calls requirements. So there's a lot of kind of language here that's very similar, and it can be somewhat confusing when you look at it. What you need to know is that basically Archibus wants you to generate a series of actionable requirements that the company has to follow. And those actionable requirements are broken and grouped into something called programs, and those are grouped into something called a regulation. So a requirement itself is going to be the action that is taken, the preventive maintenance procedure that's being executed, or an inspection that's going to be executed. So we'll talk a little bit about compliance drill down, and then I'll show you the rest of these steps. Okay. After that, we'll talk a little bit about setup, which is kind of typical Archibus setup, but which is fairly confusing if you start by looking at it first of all and trying to figure it out. So I'm going to do that later, but that is basically to create something called regulation categories and types, program categories and types, requirement types. Those are all the kind of drop-down lists that you'll use to fill out your contracts and requirements. You'll have to enter in vendors in some cases if your requirements are related to a vendor service contract. And of course, there's the notification templates and document templates and categories and violation types that you kind of set up as your drop-down menus. But let me just jump right into the product here, because we got very little time to cover a lot of this. So I'm going to hop into the Archibus application now and just show you these steps and what they look like in the system. There is a lot of detail in the compliance application, and what I always tell people is focus on what you need to get out of Archibus. Just put into it what you need to get out of it. Just because something is there, just because a field is available on a form, it doesn't mean you need to fill it out. And that's especially true of the compliance application. So if you click on sustainability and risk, there's an application called compliance. This is that umbrella application. Again, you're going to notice a lot of different menu options: project manager, program coordinator, and so on and so forth. Okay, I'm going to just focus on the steps you need to take. Okay, so what you need to do first, like we said, is manage your compliance drill down. That means go into, as a program manager in this case, the tool called Manage Compliance Drill Down. And basically inventory all of the things that you have to be responsible for, that you want to assign accountability for, and that you want to provide a governance framework for. okay? And that happens on this one screen. So what that means is you start off, as we said, with all of your regulations. And here on the left is a series of examples of regulations: elevator safety, cleaning requirements, asbestos requirements, air supply. This is occupational health and safety, signage. There's a whole variety of different things here that you could be that could be entered in here. Joint Commission, this is a US hospital kind of regulation requirement. Anyway, you create this list, you gather all of these requirements that you have, and there's hundreds of them, right? And basically what you do is you want to set up, I'm just going to choose any one of these here. I think elevator safety is pretty standard. Okay, we'll set up elevator safety as something you want to comply with. You need to make sure that all of your elevators are being inspected on a regular basis and that they're up to code. So basically you say, I have a regulation. The regulation is elevator safety. That's the goal. That's the requirement that we have. Now, you need to only fill out some basic details for yourself. The regulation, maybe the date that the compliance is required, maybe the start and the end date, the name of the regulation, a brief description, maybe the website where the information is being stored. These are all kind of useful pieces of information. Are any of these necessary? No. The only thing that's necessary is the fact that you identify the regulation. So just at least fill that out and save this as a record, okay? Because a lot of this other detail you can come later on as you get into the more detailed requirements. So step one is fill out a regulation, okay? Now within that regulation, just like a lot of Archibus, you'll go into the plus sign up at the top, and then you'll go in and fill out a compliance program. I said a program is kind of like your planned activity. What is it you're planning? What actions or set of actions are you planning to take to meet this requirement of elevator safety? And so in this case, for example, whoever did this says, well, there isn't much of a particular program. We just have to run a regular elevator safety program. So again, a very simple way of filling out the screen is just to make sure that elevator safety has a program associated with it. In this particular case, it's elevator safety, and the code is elevator safety. Very simple. Here's the important part of compliance. It's the accountability. So although it's not required, it is basically a requirement here to put in a responsible person, the person who oversees elevator safety at your organization and is going to be the person responsible for that. Okay, so here's a very important piece of the program, which is making sure that you have a responsible party. This is your accountability piece. Then you can assign, if you want, a project that you've set up to work on a program. If you have a vendor service agreement with for this particular elevator safety program, you can identify a vendor. Again, there's a summary, there's a description. If you have a specific start and end date for this program, as opposed to maybe another elevator safety program that you're running, you can do that again as well. A lot of this does have functionality within the system, but a lot of it's not necessary to get up and running. So if you want to type in, for example, the program type, the type of category, the compliance priority for the organization, all of these things are informational. They'll feed into the reports later on, but not necessary to get up and running. So that's step number two. Step number two is managing this compliance drill down. The last step, and the key step, is then identifying the actionable tasks. What is it that you're going to do on a regular or monthly basis to comply with elevator safety? And as you can see here, there are kind of three things in this case that have to be done in order to maintain elevator safety in this organization. One is that you have regular PMs associated with your elevators, so that you're checking them every 3 months, every 6 months, and so on. And so what again you do is you create, I'm going to click on this guy here, elevator regulation requirement called elevator preventive maintenance. So you're saying we are going to do regular preventive maintenance on our elevators, and we expect to do that. And in fact, this guy, Jared Green, he's going to be responsible for this. He's going to be responsible for making sure this stuff is done. And at the end of the quarter or the end of the year, we're going to be checking in with him. And again, you don't have to fill out everything here, but making someone responsible is important. Having a vendor that's responsible, if that's the case, should be important. Having both people, if they're going to be part of this joint venture, identified is key. Then, of course, a lot of the other stuff is informational. When does this start? When does it end? When does it expire or renew? All of these dates, we'll have reports that you can report on. But again, to get up and using the application, it's not necessary. You just want to go in there and identify those things. Now, for an operational level, then there are some things that you really should be doing to make sure that you're going to somehow be able to manage and track that this is being done. So first of all, there's a really key button over here on the right-hand side of every requirement, and it's called Assign PM Procedures. If this is a preventive maintenance action that you're going to take and you have Archibus to use preventive maintenance, then it's key that you set up the preventive maintenance procedures that you want to associate with this requirement to show that you're doing your elevator safety. I'm not going to click on it now, but you can click on it. And what that does is it builds a report later on of all of the work orders that are associated with those PM procedures. And so that you can go to that report after the fact and say, I want to see what I've been doing for elevator safety. I want to see what work orders and work requests were completed in what time frame for this compliance requirement. And it doesn't matter what team it is, what building it is, if they're all associated with this compliance requirement, you can do your general reporting on compliance with your preventive maintenance procedure for elevator safety using the application. So I'll show you, I'm not going to show you right now, but there is, for example, under the reports, there's an option to look at your work history somewhere in here. Work status report. So programs with active work, programs with overdue work, programs with overdue PM schedules, compliance, work history. There's a whole series of reports like that just for tracking these procedures. In addition to that, then we might create a different requirement for a regular annual inspection. Every single elevator has to be annually inspected by an outside company, right? So again, you'll enter that in as a requirement. Identify this as an inspection type if you want. Again, identify someone who's responsible for from managing that requirement, and then of course filling out whatever details are required. Now, if it's an external inspection, they might come in and do their own inspection. But if it's an internal inspection, for example, the other thing you want to do on the screen is assign a questionnaire. This is an Archibus, function, which is available in the system for, let's say, elevator inspections. So you can set up an elevator inspection checklist here that you're going to run internally with questions like the make, the model, the installation, the number of landings, and then all the different checks that you want to make: actual speed going up, actual speed going down, going up full, going down empty, and so on. And so you can set up this type of a survey to track and run your procedure. Now, to make sure that you don't forget these things, then after you create the requirement, you can set up what Archibus calls an event to regularly generate records to remind you that these things have to get done. So for the inspection, you can generate an inspection record annually, before your actual inspection occurs, to make sure that you go in and you kind of plan this. You can create a fire drill in the system to make sure that you do a regularly scheduled fire drill against each of the locations. You can associate events with your preventive maintenance. Now, obviously, preventive maintenance in Archibus already schedules their own types of events, work orders, but you might need to have some kind of a check. If you have contractors doing your work, it might be good for you to have, once a month, a review of their staff, a review of the work they're doing, a verification of the work, and so on. So these types of events are good for, as we said, governance, and the person who's accountable can be responsible for managing these types of events. So again, all of at the actionable level, the requirement is what you're actually going to be working with day to day. This is what you're kind of focused on. And all these other guys are kind of your overall umbrella view of the world. So that's managing your compliance drill down is the step one, as I mentioned. Step two, based on our list, is to then assign preventive maintenance schedules to comply, which we talked about. You can connect your preventive maintenance to the requirement. Then you can develop your questionnaires for the inspections themselves. So I'll show you where to do that. So after you set up this drill down, if you want to go in after the fact and assign the questionnaires, well, first of all, you have to have questionnaires to assign. So you also need to define compliance questionnaires in this case. I'm going to assume everyone has already got preventive maintenance schedules already set up in Archibus, because that's quite common. But questionnaires is a fairly new feature in the Archibus world. It's only probably about 8 or 9 years old. But this allows you to go in and set up checklists, surveys, inspection items, and you can have nested checklists as well. So if you have to do one set of inspections first, and based on the questions and answers to those questions, you want to do another checklist, you can set those up. You can make sure that people do a a safety check prior to going in and doing an inspection. Then they can fill out an inspection as they go through and do the work order. So you can actually have multiple inspections assigned to an individual work order or an individual event. But again, here's just an example of setting up a questionnaire. You have a page that looks like this. There's a series of questions on the page, and you'll go in and say, I want to add a question. And it gives you a bunch of questions by default: yes, no, pass, fail, date, time, lookup, a measurement that you want to take, upload a photo, search existing, whatever it is. You can basically say, this is pass or fail, this is text, this is multiple choice, single choice, and then it asks you to fill out the question. And then you can say, well, I want to have question number 10. You type in the text, you choose whether it's required, and then you choose out your available answers. And you can have, as you can see here, multiple answers, and they can have multiple choices and so on. And once you fill out, I'm just going to type in anything there. Once you fill out the question, the answer can actually prompt you to add comments. Why is this a problem? Why did it fail? To prompt for photos. Can you please take a picture of the problem area or whatever? And my favorite is create a work order. Create a work order based on the answer to this question. If something fails during an inspection, you don't want to just leave it there. You need to create some action for someone to take care of it. So Archibus's inspect questionnaire functionality allows you to automatically generate a work order right from the inspection itself to your team to go out and fix that issue right away. So that's also interesting. And you can add up multiple follow-up answers if you want. So if the answer to this is a no, and that's going to generate another question, well, then you can have a follow-up option, yes, no, and you can fill out the question text for the yes, no answer. So it can get quite elaborate in terms of how the system works, but ultimately what you're trying to do is make sure people are doing their jobs and be able to generate an activity like a work order to go out and fix whatever problems are found. Now, that was, as we said, these are the kind of top 3 things you want to start doing. And after that, as the people responsible, you can generate events and manage those events and any violations. So in Archibus, there are additional views for being able to generate your events. So from the manage compliance drill down, which is the same thing we looked at earlier, if we go in and we looked at elevator safety, and we looked at the inspection, down below, you can see that there is a scheduling tool where it gives you a date for initial scheduling, an end date for the schedule, and it will ask you, do you want to generate a different event for each location, and what should it be titled? Do you want to activate notifications for this, and so on? And then there's a recurrence pattern on the right-hand side. So you can do this monthly, you can do it weekly, you can do it quarterly, you can do it on the 3rd day of the month, Friday, Saturday, weekday of the month, and so on. But you press save and generate events, and it works very similar to preventive maintenance for maintenance activities, but for regulatory activities. And so now we can go ahead and manage those events. So the second kind of key screen is to manage your compliance events as the day-to-day. So once you have the system set up, what you're basically doing is keeping track of these activities, these events that you're responsible for. You can manage the events like you do in a work order in Archibus, where each event has a workflow status, requested, approved, rejected. It has a compliance associated with it. It can have notifications associated with that particular event, and it can have verification, date completed, date closed, date started, almost like a work order system, but for each compliance item, okay? And as you can see, each event can be associated with a documentation, with communication logs, with a work history. If you've generated work requests or service requests, or there's PM schedules associated with it, you'll see all that down here. And any email notifications that went out as part of this compliance event are located here as well. So you can actually see what's gone out with that email. Okay, so that's a key thing. Now we're almost out of time, so I've got to kind of get through some of this. There are screens as well. The other one is if you want to keep track of costs and issues associated with your contracts or any regulatory item. There are places to keep track of the violations, for example, fees, penalties, fines. You can keep track of the violation and any of the costs associated with the violations. And there's a lot of different activities, but these are the key activities. This is the key functionality of the system. Another, I think, thing I haven't mentioned, which is also probably important, is the requirement itself. If you get into more detail, or you want to have more detail, the requirement that we talked about, this, which is the kind of key actionable item. That requirement, once you've set it up, can have costs associated with it. It can have location associated with it. So here we have another screen for managing requirements, and you'll see on top of that screen, there's the ability to further define the requirement, identify locations that the requirement is going to be responsible for, keep track of the different events associated with the requirement, the documentations, communications, questionnaires, and so on. So you can get into more detail. Now, Archibus does have, for contract management, a contract manager tool, and this is, I don't want to confuse things, so I'm not going to show you this, but if the requirement that you have identified is a contract, then there's also the ability to keep track of costs associated with that contract as well. So you'll see there's a contract cost view, which allows you to manage the costs of a contract. Of course, you have to schedule one, have to choose one, and then you'll be able to kind of keep track of the overall cost commitment of the contract, the current amount that's been paid and the remaining obligation. So there's a lot of information associated with contracts that can also be included as part of the requirements that you have. But I'm not going to go into those details. That can be saved for a training or a detailed training. Now, as part of this presentation, we also want to give you the steps for setting up the system. Now, I'm telling you right here that you don't have to go into all that background if you don't want to. You can just do what we just talked about. Manage that compliance drill down, focus on it, get your preventive maintenance and questionnaires linked to your requirements, and take advantage of the reporting. And if you want to generate the events and manage the events as those, as kind of a governance policy, that's great too. For reporting purposes, or for to create a good framework for the way that you do business, then you might want to think about this part two, some of the setup that Archibus has, which is where you define regulation categories, types, program categories, and so on. And for that, just like anything in Archibus, you would typically go into your background data for compliance and go in and fill out what is basically your drop-down lists, right? So for regulation categories and types, you'll have a drop-down list of environmental, human resource, joint commission regulations. And within each of those, you'll have your own types. If it's environmental, is it related to air, green building, chemical, so on, human resources, joint commission stuff. These are all just the different types of categories and types that you can use to report on your requirements. And all of the background data is like this. You can fill this out as you wish, and then take advantage of that for reporting. But I'd say it's not required at the beginning. Don't get stuck on this too much. Build out the requirements first, and sometimes it's actually easier to build out your requirements and the actual work that you're going to be doing first, and then go back and organize a framework around how you do business, and then assign a responsibility. So I often tell clients, do this after you set up the requirements as opposed to before. So it's just a list of things here that you might find as you go through the forms of drop-down buttons. So we have, again, program categories and types and so on. Notifications as well. There are notification templates that you can create. These are nice for setting up email notifications and controlling when a notification goes out. So for example, you can say things like, you can create triggers. If a compliance item meets its end date and it's not yet finished, then generate a notification at the 2 days after the schedule start, 2 days after the end, 2 days after the completion is required. If the status is the following, blah, blah, blah. And you can resend that notification every couple of days until until you've sent 3 notifications. And that way you can make sure that you are doing your due diligence to make sure that that item is being actioned. So I think in terms of Archibus notifications, this is one of the most flexible emailing functionalities in the whole system, and it's worth looking at these templates for managing the way that you send emails out. There's the ability to keep track of a type of document library. Again, compliance touches on all sorts of different departments within an organization, so you might want to have documents associated with those departments and be able to find them easily. So there's a whole document library set of folder structure that you can create in Archibus to manage the documents. Obviously, if you're going to keep track of violations, you want to set up violation types, whether it's for building codes, expired licenses, permits, and so on. And of course, any other things that you want to use within the application. As you can see, it's a big application, and today we just have the time to focus on the key steps. So I'm going to call it quits here because we're about 40 minutes in. As you can see, you can probably go on and on about compliance, but we want to focus on just what it takes to get up and running and to get some easy wins with the system. The idea is, as we said, you set up compliance to keep track of all of the things that represent risks and all of the actions that you as an organization need to take to, remedy those risks or reduce those risks. And not just do that, not just make a list, but tie them back to actual actions and activities that you do day to day and generate a framework for how to kind of keep track of that. So in summary, compliance, the application is providing a means of identifying the risk, assigning the accountability for each of those items to a person, and then developing actionable plans to avoid that risk. It provides a means of reviewing the costs of managing the risk versus the potential risk itself, which is taking place in the cost fields that we talked about. And most importantly, it is providing an organization-wide framework for accountability. It's about communicating and getting everybody on the same page so everybody follows the same method for how to make sure that you're accountable for that risk. And the goal, of course, is huge for organizations because it's going to reduce financial penalties. It should be reducing environmental impacts. And most importantly for everybody on the call, it should be increasing the health and safety of the people in our workplace. So hope this is interesting. Obviously, if you have additional questions, we have a few minutes to answer those questions here. So I'll stay on the line for a minute or so if anyone has a chat or a question, and we can answer that. If you have other questions, if you want to have, if you want services or training related to this application, feel free to contact the people I have on the next slide. But as a reminder, this is the 7th session, Avoiding Risk Through Compliance. We have 3 more sessions planned in this Horizon Knowledge Series. The next one is kind of more up everyone's alley at the moment in terms of workplace, which is right-sizing your workplace with Archibus, meaning how can you take advantage of Archibus's space, reservations, hoteling, and team applications to make sure that you've got the right fit for the number of people that you have in your building at any given point. And then the 9th session will be on cost administration within Archibus, which means managing the property costs, maybe prorating those property costs and identifying departmental responsibility and so on. And then lastly is more of an administrative session, but it's on a specific function in Archibus, which is the home pages and metrics. And the idea behind home pages and metrics is that you can generate actions on the main screen of the system when you log in that people can follow up on. So with that, again, thank you everybody for participating. If you have information about this series, he wasn't on at the beginning of the call, but you can contact Ian Newman. I believe he's listening in. He's in our digital marketing department. And if you have any requests for further training or services, please feel free to contact Kelly Welch, our sales support manager. And with that, I'm going to take a look at the questions and we can review a few of those questions.
I am now here at the end, and I believe, Sean, Rory had a question there that says, how would you assign a work or requirement to a work team rather than an individual?
I'm sorry, just repeat that one more time.
How would you assign a requirement to a work team rather than to an individual?
Oh, yeah, this is an interesting question. That if you have an actionable item that you want, then the way that you assign a work team is to generate a work order, which follows an SLA, which you assign to a work team, right? That means that the work team can be responsible for the item. Compliance is not about that. It's not about assigning it to a team of people to do. It's about making a person responsible. And so the idea here is you would not assign this to the work team. I mean, you can set up your work team as a vendor, right? But if you're talking about internal work teams that you use for maintenance, right? And setting them up as a vendor in the system, you don't want to do that. You don't want to have your maintenance teams in 2 places, in the work teams table and in the vendor table. So the only kind of team concept is the vendor, the idea of the vendor that's coming in from outside. And so when in the case of a vendor, you don't know who they're going to make responsible, but you have a contract with that vendor, and that vendor is the responsible party. So you can make a vendor responsible in Archibus, meaning that there's a field for the vendor. But when it comes to the actual responsibility of the item, you need to have a person's name one person is that person that's directly responsible for that, and that has to get updated, regularly whenever you update that person, because you can't call a team. As soon as you assign a team, you go to the team and say, well, who's responsible for this? Someone's going to say, oh, I didn't know about it, or the other person's going to say, I don't know about it. That's not the idea here. The idea here is you are requiring an individual to know what's going on with this. This is what accountability is about. This is what governance is about. So I don't know if you agree with that or not, Rory, but that was the idea behind the setup of the application.
I believe that was the only question that we had in the chat. So, I guess we'll wrap it up. Like you said, everyone else had any questions, direct it to me, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks for space planning and reservations.